Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of ICIJ's La Coalición, our podcast. I'm joined by a really honorable guest here. Thank you for taking the time, Alet, for joining us for this really important episode. We have opened our eyes to a lot of situation going on in Palestine. And here locally, we think that there's a lot of opportunity to build collaborative power. And I'm really excited to have you on and talk about how we can work together in these different conditions as we were before October 7th. So much happening between now and then. This is an episode that's been a long time coming. And I'm really excited to have you on to talk about these issues, these conditions, and how we can support and ally with each other. But first, I would love for the community to get to know you a little bit more. And if you could introduce yourself, and if you want to share a little bit about our icebreaker question for today is, what is your favorite Palestinian street food? So I'll kick it off and send it over to you.
Well, thank you, Eddie, for having me. I'm excited to be here. I am currently supporting Muslim Visionaries as a senior communications advisor. And my favorite Palestinian street food is going to be a falafel sandwich.
Yeah, that sounds delicious. Let's
It
go.
is.
Yeah. And then my favorite Mexican street food is an esquite, which is like a corn cup with the mayo and the chili powder and the delicious white corn. Can't get enough of that. Can always go for one. So thank you for sharing that. Muslim Visionaries, you mentioned them. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about what the organization is and what they do?
Sure. So, Muslim Visionaries is sort of, I would say, the political uh, part of Sahaba Initiative, which is an older organization in the Inland Empire that provides services for low income communities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Before, for probably over a decade now, they've provided free meals, they've done food drives. They provided like mental health services for the communities in and around San Bernardino County. So in Riverside County, they do really good work, and they've now expanded uh, to start Muslim Visionaries to build political power in the Inland Empire.
That's exciting. I Thanks for reminding me about Saha because I need to follow up with Malek and do a tour of the facility both here in the San Bernardino area. I'm excited about collaborating with them, and ICIJ can work together on some festivals and events to bring more resources to the community together.
Definitely.
Thanks for that pointer and the reminder. But let's move on to the first question that we have, which is, if you don't mind sharing a bit of your or your family's immigrant story and how that led you to the Inland Empire and how the IE became your home.
Um, we have there is so much to share about my family's immigration story. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. But my maternal grandfather left Palestine, was pushed out of Palestine, I should say, in the 60s, and he ended up in Brazil. He stayed there for a few years and then ended up in Puerto Rico. So that's where my mom was born, and that's where she spent her formative years before he moved them back to Palestine. And so, after a few years, her and my dad got married, and she was obviously an American citizen, but he didn't want to live in the United States. And so he kept going back and forth.
Yeah.
Um, you know, she wasn't able, when she got pregnant with me, I'm the oldest, uh, because she was living there technically illegally as an American citizen.
Yeah.
She had to, you know, go to a special hospital that serviced people without Palestinian citizenship in
Mm.
Jerusalem.
Mm.
And that was during the first Intifada, which was an all out war. A couple of years later, she had my brother when the Iraqis were throwing missiles at Israel in 91. So she has these crazy like war stories of how she had us. But anyway, my dad ended up like taking us to the United States, and he never really thought he would live in the United States long term. It was more like, let's get these kids papers just in case something happens.
Yeah.
Um, so we were there until 2002 when the second Intifada broke out. And for 2 years, the Israelis shut down the schools. They would like, they wouldn't let the teachers into the village. And so my dad was like, okay, so like, you all haven't had school for 2 years. We need to leave. So I came back in 2002 to Fontana. By then, a lot of my uncles and my family were already here. And so it was the natural choice for my parents. And I ended up at Etowanda High School,
Yeah.
ninth grade.
Shout outs.
A shout out to Etowanda. And it was a very interesting experience because it was 1 year after 9/11. So there was, the community as a whole was very welcoming. But, there was like that one racist science teacher that I still remember.
Of course.
And yeah, uh, it was difficult, I didn't have many friends, but then I made friends with random people, and
Yeah.
it was good.
Yeah. And now let me lead off with that because I know Fontana has a pretty sizable Muslim community now. So when did you see that change? Was that a few years down the line, or has that always been there, just not really in our purview?
You know, if I had to guess, I think what was happening is a lot of people came as students or they came to build businesses like my family.
Oh, okay.
And so for people who came to build businesses because they didn't have education to fall back on, the Inland Empire was an affordable place. It was a safe place. It's always been a largely like Latino community, which is what my family was most comfortable with, having come from different parts of Latin America.
Yeah.
And so it was easy for it to become their home.
Got it.
And then we've seen other refugee communities from the Arab world come in following years. Libyans, Egyptians, like North Africans, but also like a ton of Lebanese, Jordanians. We have a sizable Christian Arab community, especially in the San Bernardino area. And I think it's just the community has now grown to just be a safe space for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I remember when I moved here from Orange County, and I grew up in all over LA and Orange County in Mexico, but particularly when I moved from Santa Ana to Moreno Valley, it was a bit of a culture shock because I could count on my hand how many white and black people I've met when I was living in Santana. And then when I came here to the IE, there were Filipinos, Pacific Islanders, Arab, black people. I was like shocked how many different cultures and people there were. And this was back when I was in seventh grade. So to your point about how the IE has always been a welcoming place to people of color, different backgrounds, and hopefully some of the policy work and advocacy work that we'll touch on later can continue to build on them, building that leadership and power that we desperately need to take back control of our communities.
Well, I'll add one thing because I lived in Orange County and I know exactly what you're talking about. And I actually lived South Orange County, which is, it's not very diverse. So my oldest son was in a classroom where he was out of 24 kids from the AM and PM sessions. He was like one of 3 people of color.
Wow.
The rest were white or a white with another mix, so white passing.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult on me, on him. He told me, he's like, "Mama, why do you have brown eyes?"
Oh my
A
goodness.
few months in. So yeah, now in Fontana, I have a son who's in a classroom with kids that look like him, and it just maybe the school doesn't have as many resources as the school in Orange County, but I know my son is in a safer environment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you. Let's move on now to the next conversation. So I think, like I mentioned earlier in the beginning, a lot of the mobilization that's happened here happened organically first, right after October 7th. And then we really started to open our eyes. ICIJ and other of our partner organizations started to open our eyes to the Muslim community and the existing organizing efforts around Palestine. And we started to work together around those issues. So from your perspective, what are some of your experiences in regards to the advocacy efforts in the IE? And if you can share some of the challenges and some of the wins as well that you've encountered over the last 6-7 months or so.
Well, thank you for that question. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of my friends and family who've been killed in the brutal bombings for the last 9 months. All of us have been watching the news for months now as Israel has targeted hospitals, homes, schools, all while cutting off food, uh, water, electricity, and medicine to more than 2 million people, half of whom are children. And so the latest figures are that 35,000 Palestinians were killed, including 15,000 children. And we know that the numbers are probably much higher when you account for the people under the rubble and people who are missing. And those figures are up to 10,000 now. So we won't have the correct figures until hopefully there's a ceasefire. And we know from the polls that the majority of Americans want a ceasefire, but that the politicians aren't listening. So locally, I think the most significant discovery has been understanding how little our public officials care about their constituents when it comes to protecting their financial and political interests. I think for those of us doing political work, it's kind of obvious, but for people who kind of like the genocide activated them, they have been in shock. Because they're like, we're making the calls, we're protesting, and no one is listening. Yeah, because you also don't have a few million to throw at these politicians. So in the IE, of course, we saw this before, the genocide. We see it with the warehouses. We see it with the pollution that the warehouses are causing. And, you know, the low-income jobs that are being created with no accountability from corporations and politicians. So I think one thing that we have been doing is targeting two Congress members, Pete Aguilar and Norma Torres, who have really been cheerleaders for Israel's genocide the last 9 months. Pete Aguilar is an interesting person because he's someone who had dinner at my uncle's house several times. He's someone who like used to come to our family events, and you know, our family and friends, they collected tons of donations for him, and now he doesn't even take our calls. A couple of years ago, the Israel lobby started investing heavily in him. So it was at that point that he started coming out with these like pro-apartheid, pro-occupation talking points straight out of AIPAC. And AIPAC, for the listeners who don't know, is the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. They're kind of the main pro-Israel lobby in the United States. Now, AIPAC has a PAC, a Political Action Committee. On their website, it features like this statement that says, "We stand with those who stand with Israel," above photos of senior leaders from both parties. And one of those photos is Pete Aguilar.
Yeah.
So, you know, it wasn't surprising for us that he'd come out so pro-genocide, because when you look at the numbers, since he became a Congress member, he, starting 2 years ago, began receiving a ton of money from these groups. So when you go to Open Secrets, it's a website that shows how much funding these Congress members are getting. In 2020, he had no money that we can see from pro-Israel. Maybe they gave him, but it was so insignificant. It wasn't part of like the top donors.
Yeah.
In 2022, you start seeing the pro-Israel lobby as number 3 for Aguilar with 116,000 in donations. Since then, you're talking about a 2-year period. He's received $734,000 from them. So you just follow the money. Norma Torres, similar story. We're doing everything we can to, you know, protest in front of her office, call her office. At this point, there are days where they just turn off the line. They don't want to hear it. For years, she also met with Arab and Muslim donors. She met with the community. The community knows her very well. In 2020, and then in Open Secrets, I went to check. In 2020 to 2021, public sector unions made up the largest donors for her at 41,000. By 2022, that number had jumped to 54,000. Now, you look at last year in 2023, 2024, pro-Israel funds jump to 67,000. And so now it's like one of her top donors. So it's you just follow the money in all of these situations. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention about Pete Aguilar, also the military and weapons manufacturers are also one of his top donors.
I think those two just go together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, and I think that those two particular congressional members are Latino. One is from Guatemala, and the other one has Mexican origin. His grandfather, Pete's grandfather, immigrated from Mexico. And that's something that folks should really take into consideration when they're voting for certain folks who may appear like them, may have the same last name as them, but their values certainly do not align with our values here. And I can say that for my family as well. Just watching this unfold and seeing that it's somebody that came from our background, so in support of Israel, so in support of genocide, has been a point of reflection for a lot of the community members here locally. And I hope that we can mobilize those reflections into not just anger, rightfully so, but into action down the line. And hopefully some of the wins that we'll get down the line, if you can talk about some of the wins that we have seen, right? Those are some challenges. Those members are deeply ingrained in APAC money, but there's some others that aren't.
Yes, 100%. I think with Pete Aguilar, just one more point, one of his biggest donors also, or it used to be, I need to double check the numbers, it was like the real estate lobby. So now you're talking about separate from genocide in the Inland Empire, where you have so many people who now can't afford homes and rent is so expensive. Who is he advocating for?
So, yeah, thank you for illustrating some of the challenges. We have a lot of work to do when it comes to the federal representatives in the area, but there's also some victories, and I would love for you to take the opportunity to share what those victories are.
Sure. I would say, uh, in terms of the victories, I think the genocide has really brought the community together, and not just like Arab and Muslim community, it's really brought everyone in the IE, at least locally, together. We're working with all kinds of groups, as you know, Eddie. And I think that's a huge benefit to local politics because that's how you begin to build power. And that's what's missing in our communities. Everyone is doing amazing work on the individual level, on the organizational level, but we now need to take it an extra step and start thinking about how we build long-term political power. And so I truly feel like Palestine has done that, or at least has kind of started that process, and I think that's a huge win.
Yeah.
Um, Despite all of the negative things I mentioned about the pro-genocide side sort of having the money for the lobbyists and whatnot, we are seeing the power of organizing with a ton of people. So, early on, we started a campaign to get Rep. Mark Takano in Riverside to call for a ceasefire. And, we created a coalition. You were obviously a part of it, as you know, to sort of do phone calls, protests, and write letters. And within a couple of weeks, he called for a ceasefire. And that couldn't have happened without us having thousands of people call in. So that was sort of a really good lesson in how to organize well, and when organizing comes up with positive results.
And really quickly, I want to also share the example that you shared with me earlier about that one student that started just protesting outside of, I think it was Chino.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you see all these people galvanize around this one student that just stood up and said, enough is enough.
Yeah, it was pretty much a kid. And they were, I think, Hussam, one of the people I work with, mentioned that they would go into the city council meetings week after week, and then they got more people involved and it became like a movement, and they got them to call for a ceasefire.
Wow.
So we're seeing
Amazing.
a lot of wins like that,
Yeah.
where we know that if the city council can change on this, then they can probably change on other issues pertaining to, you know, immigration, or maybe
Just divestment in general, right? Yeah.
divestment in general. For sure.
Because we're talking about the connection between some of our particular interest in immigration policy, which is deportation defense and shutting down the Adelanto detention facility up here by the Mojave National Preserve. And we're making these connections with Congressmember Aguilar, Congresswoman Norma Torres, about how the violence that ensued, not just at the border, but here locally, with ICE having some of the largest activities in San Bernardino County here. We have some of the most arrests all over the country here locally, and it's largely to do because we have huge bed spaces available for people to be detained in. So the correlation is when you have a facility for immigrant people, they're going to fill that facility with immigrant people, right? And that's something that we've tried to illustrate to our congressional members time and time again, and something that we'll continue to do in advocating for the shutdown of Adelanto, but with also keeping in mind how this is connected to Palestine and Israel, in particular with the funding of border surveillance, with the funding of the violence that ensued at the border and here locally by the IDF, and by the Israeli military that's training local police departments everywhere, and how we're seeing that play out in our communities locally. More militarized police in the streets means more violence for Black and brown communities, indigenous communities, and that's obviously something that we want to prevent from happening, right?
Yes, and just to add to that point, like it's really important for us to learn our history and the history of like these weapons manufacturers, the surveillance technology, because somehow, some way, it always connects to Israel. And in the case of the immigrant communities here, Israel's military relations with right-wing groups and regimes spans Latin America from Mexico to the southmost tip of Chile, starting just a few years after the establishment of Israel. So you're talking about like Israel supplied, trained, and advised Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, several countries. They're still doing it. And, they're supporting, I would say, a lot of these wars, a lot of these civil wars, a lot of these massacres. And, why are people leaving their countries? No one is just leaving their country because they want to. A lot of us, including my family, were pushed out because of war and other issues. So to make that connection is very important, because when you understand that when Israel creates these bombs that they're experimenting on kids in Gaza, they're experimenting on them so that they can go back to these countries and sell it to them as surveillance and weapons, and then they come and they use them in the United States.
Well, that's one of their major exports, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we saw this with the border wall. We saw this with surveillance on the border wall. We're seeing this in surveillance in other communities, like you mentioned, ICE. We're seeing this with police brutality, and that why are police, you've been seeing the videos come out of college campuses. You're trying to tell me these kids at Ivy League campuses that probably they never even got in trouble now need this type of police brutality to take them out of a tent they bought off of Amazon for $40. Like, it's so I think people are starting to make the connections, but on the local level, for us to do that is super important, because again, then we can move forward and we can build long-term strategies to make change locally.
Definitely. Yeah, I think, like you mentioned, people are starting to make those connections a lot more now. We were talking a little bit before the podcast started about how when people are in debt, things become much more clear, and they tend to, go in survival mode and really look at what do I need to do for my family, right? And they start to de-alliance themselves with like their political party, right? So I think that has been a natural thing that's occurred over the last year or so, because of inflation, because of the war in Palestine, because of so many things happening around the world. We're seeing things unravel, right, in this country and this empire. And I think one of the major things that can benefit the liberation of Palestine is the loosening of U.S. hegemony all over the world when it comes to knowing your history. You mentioned that earlier. I wanted to bring that back to that. In Mexico, where my family comes from, where I lived for several years, there are connections to Israeli scientists going into Mexico and training cartels on how to make drugs. and how to manufacture drugs at a large scale. And we will cite everything in the notes so people know exactly what I'm talking about. But there is also a deep connection to that squad's being trained by the Israeli military as well. So we're not just pulling things from the air and trying to jumble it up together and say these are all connected. They are material historical facts connecting all of our struggles together. And I'm hoping that folks will start to really open their eyes and convalesce around a class solidarity of oppressed people. And I think that can be part of the base for building real mobilization and changing the political structure for the IE.
100%.
Yeah, yeah. So, wow, we've gone through this episode pretty quickly, but I think for the listeners at home, they understand what ICIJ is. We think that they've been listening to our episodes and understand how we work in coalition, right? One of our biggest strengths is working collaboratively with other organizations, with other individuals. And now we're starting to work with the Muslim community here locally in the IE. So how can we, as ICIJs, other orgs based in the Island Empire, best support the Free Palestine movement? And how can individuals best get involved as well?
That's a really good question. I think short term, we need an end to the genocide. There's like no question asked. Whatever we need to do to stop the bloodshed. So we need a ceasefire immediately. So for your listeners, just calling their representatives, going to protests, posting on social media. One thing I didn't get a chance to talk about was the local media and mainstream media being owned by these monopolies means that there's a lot of fake information that they're just spewing from the Israeli government. So anything the Israeli government is saying, they're taking as facts. So that's, what they're reporting. The New York Times has been caught several times in the last 8 months lying, but no one can hold them accountable because they're the New York Times. So it's really important for your listeners to be on social media sharing things from the Institute for Middle East Understanding, for example. On Instagram they have really good stuff. The BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, some of the bigger journalists in Gaza that are reporting in real time what's happening, including like Bisan and a few others that I can always reference, and you can include in the notes.
Definitely.
So I think those are like short-term things we can do. In the long term, I mentioned this, but I just want to reiterate that we as local communities of color, we need to think about building power and how we do it locally on a more serious level. I think our political offices in the Inland Empire do not match the racial makeup of the cities we live in. That's a huge problem. We know that many of our offices are lacking Latino, Asian, and Black representatives. And because of this, those officials do not represent us. I think that they're allowing big corporations to come in and, take up our land, build these big warehouses that are destroying our environment. They're building unaffordable housing, and that's all a policy choice. We know that this has nothing to do with the economy. It's all a policy choice. So, I think we need to think about long-term how we do that. And I already, again, mentioned this, but more education on our different struggles, be it Palestine for the Arab Muslim community, or just the broader immigrant community. And once we understand that the people funding the genocide are the same people that are dehumanizing all of us to make money in different ways, the easier it is to organize together because we know it's a shared struggle. And then just thinking seriously about how we divest from weapons manufacturers, again, that are destroying all of our communities, not just Palestine, and the surveillance industry, which is having a huge impact on our immigrant communities, as we know.
Yeah, definitely. And we're seeing that with the increasing code enforcement all over the region against street vending. They're being lumped in with other illegal activities in a racialized way, I would argue. And we're going to do some advocacy on that front, specifically with the county. So we'll probably do an episode on that in the future. So like you mentioned, these struggles are just obviously interconnected. For the folks that have been doing this work, we see those lines connected together. But for the individuals that may have not been a part of any organization before or any advocacy local efforts before, what are potentially some resources you can point them to? You mentioned the website. Maybe there's a book out there you recommend they check out and read, or other local resources they can look into.
So I'm happy to come up with like a list, an extensive list for the website for your readers. In general, I would say for news and updated news related to what's happening in Gaza right now, Al Jazeera English tends to have the only journalist left on the ground. Um, uh, right now, Israel's getting rid of journalists. I think you must have seen like the AP. They seized their offices and seized their equipment. So Al Jazeera, so far, they have journalists on the ground. For a more historical information about just what happened in Palestine starting in 1948, there is an excellent documentary. It's relatively new. I think it was released in the last year by a professor at Cal State San Bernardino. Her name is Ahlam Muhtasib, and a few others. It's called 1948. I'll be sure to send you the link so you can include it. That has a really nice history. And then I can't stress this enough. Please follow journalists on the ground. There are still, Israel targets them. I think over 200 have been killed, and almost always targeted killings. They are truly putting their lives on the line so that we can see what's happening. And so those are the people that we need to follow. They try their best to do a lot of the news in English so that, people outside of Palestine can understand what's happening.
And their families are targeted too.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. And before we close up, I wanted to touch really quickly on the media piece, because I think that's important as well for the listeners. One of the reasons why we're doing this episode is because there's not a lot of media coverage around this issue and how the work has been done here locally in the IE. It wasn't because we haven't tried. We've reached out to these outlets before. You mentioned you submitted several op-eds and other pieces, and everything has been turned down, right? So just to drive that emphasis and motivation for folks to find alternative ways to get their news, please do so and listen to some of the resources here. And you can find all those resources at our social media. We'll link it to this show note for this podcast, and everything else that we talked about, all the resources that we've used so far, it'll be there. You guys can try to fact check us. It's all good.
Yes, and just to add to the media piece, so I worked in media for over 10 years, like pitching stories. That's what I do. So I know when I'm pitching something good and when something may or may not get picked up. I have pitched numerous op-eds at this point, and stories, like when we've had protests in front of Pete Aguilar's office, Norma Torres, when we've had actions, and I've gotten responses from the journalists, and I truly believe the journalists wanted to cover. But at the last minute, several times, I want to say it happened at least 4 times, just with news stories that we pitched for them to come and cover, it gets canceled at the last minute. And there is a monopoly on the news agencies in the IE. The SoCal News Group owns the majority of like the newspapers here, the Press Enterprise, the San Bernardino Sun, OC Register. So if you go there right now, I haven't checked, to be honest, in like the last month, because I just stopped pitching stories to them. But at least a few months ago when I was pitching, they had several editorials in support of Israel in different ways. And it's clear to me that there is a bias there. And unfortunately, that's with a lot of the mainstream news agencies. We see the New York Times. We see a lot of these big papers just covering lies by the Israeli government with no accountability. So I think it's up to us to create alternative forms of media, and it's up to our followers and listeners to know where they can get legitimate media sources.
And I'll wrap it up by saying that that's a major component of changing the narrative. And one of our mission statements, when you go on our website, the first thing that you'll see is changing the narrative of the over 1 million immigrant lives in the IE. And it very much has to do with storytelling, with media, with changing the minds of people that have been anti-immigrant for so long. So that's a huge component to this movement, and we're willing to support in whatever way we can. But listeners at home, please reflect on this episode and take a look at the resources, and stay tuned for future events and collaboration efforts to come. So I think we'll wrap it up here. Ale, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everybody for listening, and we'll catch you guys at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice.
That was really good.